Welcome to the Great Hall on the McGee campus of Ulster University. You're all very welcome, and we're really delighted that you'll be joining us for this important discussion tonight, looking at 20 years since the reforms of policing in Northern Ireland. And many would say there is no more important discussion in terms of where the peace process is at and some of the important developments that happened post-1998. My name is Professor Brandon Hamber, and I'm the John Hume and Thomas P. O'Neill Chair in Peace. And it's my great pleasure to welcome you, and particularly to welcome the John and Pat Hume Foundation, who are key partners of Ulster University in hosting this event tonight. We're delighted to have been working with the Hume Foundation over the last year or so on a range of different events, and for us this is one of the highlights in our calendar. So we welcome you once again, and we look forward to the discussion tonight.
As a board member of the John and Pat Hume Foundation, I'm delighted to welcome you to this important discussion, which is part of the Foundation's efforts to make sure that we mark 20 years of the new beginning to policing. It was a byproduct of the Good Friday Agreement, and while political players helped to negotiate the terms of reference for the Patten Commission, it was many other actors and factors that brought about and achieved and drove the change that we saw in that important aspect of the entire peace process. And that's why the Foundation is delighted with Ulster University to invite this panel of people who were key players in delivering that new beginning to talk to us this evening, maybe to remind us of some of the issues and the challenges and the ambitions that surrounded the new beginning to policing, and perhaps knowing some of the people on this panel, maybe not just to talk retrospectively, but actually bring us face to face maybe with some of the current issues and challenges that we shouldn't neglect as well. So the John and Pat Hume Foundation's long title is For Peaceful Change and Reconciliation, and the new beginning to policing was a key part of the peaceful change envisaged by the Good Friday Agreement. And so many of the challenges we face in and around policing, but not confined to policing, are part of the agenda reconciliation that we need to nurture as well. So I'm delighted to hand you over to this evening's panel.
I'm Leona O'Neill, and tonight we will be reflecting on the 20th anniversary of the establishment of the PSNI here in Northern Ireland. And joining me to reflect on these 2 decades are Denis Bradley, who's former Vice Chair of the Northern Ireland Policing Board, which oversees the running of the PSNI. He's also co-chair of the consultative group on the past. He's also a much sought after commentator and journalist. Peter Smith, QC, is a member of the Independent Commission for Policing in Northern Ireland and was a leading lawyer in Northern Ireland with decades of experience at the bar. He's also CBE. Judith Gillespie served as a police officer in Northern Ireland for 32 years, making history by becoming the first woman in the RUC PSNI to become an Assistant Chief Constable in 2004. As Chief Officer for 11 years, she helped steer the organisation through significant change. She became Deputy Chief Constable in June 2009, being awarded an OBE in the same year, and 5 years later a CBE. On leaving the PSNI in 2014, she became an independent leadership advisor. She served on the Equality Commission for Northern Ireland, on the Garda Policing Authority, and is currently a member of the Probation Board for Northern Ireland. Brian Dougherty, MBE, has been involved in the voluntary and community sector for over 25 years, primarily in Unionist and loyalist areas. He was a director of St Colum's Park House Centre for Reconciliation and worked alongside the Northern Ireland Civic Forum and Northern Ireland Policing Board. He's currently working with the North West Cultural Partnership and Londonderry Bands Forum. I would like to look back on the time that the RUC transitioned to the PSNI, and I want, Denis, if you could paint a picture for us of that situation at the time. Why was there a need for change in the police at that time?
Well, like everything in Northern Ireland, there are 2 views on that. I think from the Unionist perspective, there was no need at all for change, certainly from the politics of that. From the broad nationalist community, I think that there was the feeling that not alone was there a few nationalist stroke Catholics involved in the RUC, I think it was about 11% at the time, but also that the police service had been in some ways paramilitarized by their engagement within the conflict that had been happening for so many years. I think that there's some substance to the paramilitarization because in this city alone, a very good friend of mine, he was in the RUC, he was one of the Assistant Chief Constables, his name was Frank Lagan. He actually retired because Roy Mason, who was the Secretary of State at the time, Labour Minister, actually put the police into the primary role in the middle of the Troubles, in the early days of the Troubles, in the early 70s. And that became a contentious issue and remained in some ways a contentious issue. But whatever about the politics of the situation, certainly within the negotiations that has happened around the Good Friday Agreement, there was obviously a very strong cohort of people who thought that there was need for reform. I also think, by the way, that there was many people within the RUC themselves who thought that there had become an overemphasis, obviously, on the military side rather than on the community policing side, and that needed to be rebalanced in many ways. So what you ended up with was a bit of a compromise, as we usually do in these types of situations, which is all right, it's part of the political process, which ended up with a new service called the PSNI, but carrying the deeds of the RUC with it. Now, that in some ways was a very understandable thing. It has resulted in some difficulties, particularly when people talk about legacy and all that type of thing, but that's what we were left with, and that's what we were gifted. And much of the change that actually began to happen in the initial days was actually led by the police themselves. So it's a complex story, it's an interesting story, and in many ways it's a story that I think other communities have gone through in other parts of the world around policing. But I think that the real thing that happened was that there was a very interesting group of people set up within the Patten Commission who brought a great integrity and insight and enthusiasm and understanding to the whole issue of policing, because I, at the time, would have been very, very far from the whole policing issue. But I remember reading the Patten report and thinking, this is a work of considerable importance, and that if implemented, will actually do great things for policing here, but also will have ramifications for policing in other parts on this island. So all of that was kind of playing out at that particular time. So we ended up with the PSNI.
Peter, you were involved in politics at that time and you know working in that kind of sphere. What was the feeling on the ground in Unionist circles about the changes? They're quite difficult.
Well, there certainly were very strong feelings, excuse me, among some people. And they were quite often manifested when we did our round of meeting the people right across Northern Ireland. And if you were in an area which was strongly Unionist, you could expect to take a bit of a battering. If you, on the other hand, you were in a Catholic area, you would actually be quite well received. Although there were sort of hints of Sinn Féin in the background being difficult, but nevertheless, we managed to get through that. And it was very useful, actually, to hear what people had to say. I mean, sometimes, actually, things were quite amusing, but which seems very strange against the background but
did you find difficulty yourself with even personal relationships? You know, that you were working on this reform, this kind of change and this transition. Was there pushback from people that you were involved in politics with, or even just people in your community?
No, in fact, a colleague at the bar wrote me a letter saying that he was absolutely astonished that I would stoop to signing up to such a disgraceful document and implying such criticism of the RUC, which had given so much in order to hold the fort while the terrorism was raging on. But I had to write back to him and say that if he read our terms of reference, he would understand that I could do no more or do no less than observe the terms of reference that I knew was what was required of me from the moment that I was asked to join my colleagues on the Patten Commission.
Judith, as a serving officer, that must have been a very strange time. You know, you're ending one shift as an RUC officer, you're starting the next day in a completely different uniform. The emblems are off the wall, the RUC emblem is off the front of the building. Was it a difficult transition for you, for many people?
Yeah, it was very difficult, and it was very emotionally charged. And it wasn't as if at midnight on the 3rd of November 2001 everybody had a new uniform and every police station had a new crest and everything changed overnight. It wasn't that way. For quite some months after midnight on the 3rd of November, there was a mixture of uniforms, and people felt very unprofessional about that because they felt everybody wanted to be a professional police officer. Certainly I did, and they wanted to project that professional image. But people reflected on the sacrifice that had led to the transition, and many officers and staff found that very, very difficult to take. And that's why it was so important, I guess, with the Independent Commission's report, that there was an honourable exit for people who had the service and the age and wanted to leave, and were able to leave with a voluntary severance package. So that was a very important part of the transition process. And of course, those officers leaving then created headroom for the new officers to come in under the 50-50 regime. But just reflecting on what it felt like on the 3rd of November 2001, at that time I was head of drug squad. I was a detective superintendent. And on that day, I got the squad together and we had a team photograph taken with the RUC crest and with the officers, unusually for drug squad, dressed in suits, with the police dogs, and the whole team was in the photograph. And that was my way as head of drug squad of saying to the team, this is a really important part of our past that needs to be honoured, but tomorrow is a different day and we need to look forward. And I have that photograph in my house. I keep it with great pride. But it was a time to try and move on into the new future, and not to forget the sacrifice of those who had laid the foundation to make that new future possible.
And you spoke about Ronnie Flanagan, the message that came through at midnight, and that was a very emotive message.
Yes. My husband was working that night, and of other family members who were working that night. And there was a message went out over the Belfast Regional Control and right throughout Northern Ireland through the police net. And it was a really I felt emotionally charged but emotionally intelligent message that spoke of the service and sacrifice of officers in the past, officers who were killed, officers who bore wounds, both physical and psychological wounds, that had helped to lay the foundation for this new future. It also went out on our message switching system, which was not exactly state of the art, but I wish to this day that I'd kept a copy of that message. I'm sure somewhere in the archives it's still there, but it was a really important message from the Chief Constable, who was recognising the seismic change that he was asking his officers and staff to go through.
And Brian, there was a lot of ill feeling in the Unionist community. There was a sense of betrayal almost at the RUC's end. It was a tough time to be involved in those changes, to be seen to be sort of endorsing those. What was that like for you?
Well, I mean, Peter alluded to it, but I mean, sometimes historically the narrative tends to become very binary in Northern Ireland, whereas my recollection is, it varied. I mean, at that time, I suppose, in 2-3 years after the signing of the Good Friday Agreement, I suppose we were very much in the honeymoon period in terms of exploring peace and in this sense of reconciliation and willing to push boundaries was still very much part of our psyche. And I suppose that's why, as Peter alluded to, there was animosity towards the changes, but I suppose that sense of collaboration and looking forward ensured that that didn't descend into violence, for example. But if you remember, historically and generally within the Unionist community, the Unionist community saw the RUC, as they did with the other security forces, the UDR and Royal Irish Rangers, as literally our brothers, uncles, friends, and that support and I suppose was kind of extended to the RUC at that time, or that sense of ownership. I remember, though, I mean, when I talk about it not being as clear cut as maybe some people would remember, I remember going to one of the public consultation events, with the Commission and being an outspoken kind of Unionist and working in Tully Alley at the time. We were there to defend the RUC and the honour of the RUC our fallen comrades. And I remember there was, very little kind of vociferous support coming from members of the RUC who were actually within the consultation. And I remember leaving the hall and a friend saying to me, "Why are we standing there supporting defending RUC when they aren't even prepared to defend themselves?" And I think Judith kind of maybe alluded to it slightly as well, that a lot of RUC officers at that time had maybe reached a crossroads. So they'd been through the worst of the troubles, and the potential proposals coming through from Patten in terms of particularly getting that opportunity to leave and retire early was actually welcomed by many RUC officers. Well, whenever then I was asked on to the policing board, much to my surprise as an independent member and the youngest member, I don't actually remember a great deal of animosity coming from the community I worked with. In fact, they potentially saw me as someone maybe going in there to defend the honour of the RUC. So it was always, I suppose, important that there was at least people there, to provide a balance as part of that transition.
So let's talk about that transition period. And change, as we know, is always hard. Not everyone gets on board. And there was a lot of resistance from many quarters. It wasn't just, as everything is here in Northern Ireland, there's division, and there's always a squabble about things. Denis, what was that like for you, that transition period? What was that like? What challenges did you face during that period when you were trying to help the PSI in this transition period?
It's a big, long story, but boiling it down, I had gone, a group of people had mediation in Northern Ireland, they were called out, they had organised a trip to America, and it was my first real period of time spending time with some of the leadership within the RUC, who were actually working on the transition and were working on the actual implementation of the Patten recommendations. So you had a group of people there exploring what the future was going to look like and what the implications were of all of this. I should just say, by the way, in leaving this, shouldn't be forgotten, the British government put a lot of money into this transition, I mean, the money really flew. And I don't know if we could have done it without that money, right? I think that sometimes when we praise ourselves, we need to remember that money helped in this particular set of circumstances. But anyway, I went to America and spent a week or 10 days, I can't remember, down in the south of the state, and we went into Mexico, and we looked at the different types of situations, and we looked at the way the Americans were policing some of their situations. But that was only an opportunity to let us to talk among ourselves. And I came back from that with two things. I remember two big moments, thinking, these are a good group of people. These people want change. These people are up for change. These people are working on change. And these people are positive in their attitude. And therefore, there's a chance that this will work. That was my first feeling. The second feeling was that historically, the shifting sands of our history is always pulling us back, right? So there's a very strong possibility that this won't work. So I was caught within those two worlds. The strangest and the weirdest probably moment in the early days was that the policing board, which had been set out there to kind of lead this change and in some ways offer a cover and a rationale for the implementation of all of that, was charged to actually come up with new symbols. And of course, whatever about the money and whatever about all the changes and all the work that had gone into the thing, it was totally clear that unless we got these symbols right, we were in real trouble. And we got it right because it was actually a woman called Pauline McCabe. We sent her off with a couple of people for a couple of days and says, Pauline, go and try and pull those symbols together. And we pulled the symbols together and they came back with it, and I thought, dear God, this is the first win that we need. And we got that win, and people in general were happy with the symbols, so there was a possibility that we could move to the next stage, having got through the symbols. But I think Brian's right, that the hostility within the board wasn't particularly strong. We were also gifted, I think, by a strong group of independent-minded people, and I think everywhere I go in Northern Ireland at the moment, I'm hearing criticism of our civil service and our administration. And public appointments, that they're not good enough, that they're not strong enough. I'm not near any of this stuff, but I'm hearing these types of criticism. The independent group of people who were actually appointed to the First Policing Board were an excellent group of people with their own mind, and the politicians were happy to work with that. There were difficult moments. The biggest moment, of course, was Omagh. Remember that Omagh hit us very hard, that the bomb blew up. The Ombudsman had criticised the Chief Constable and the actual thing, and that was a really explosive moment. And to be very fair, the people on the board, the politicians on the board, some of them in this room, on the board, I think I chaired for 3 days or something the ongoing meetings, and we came with a compromise position. Well, when I say a compromise position, an agreed position of actually how we handle that. And I think that was our second big win. Now, when you get a couple of wins like that, in the sense that you had the coherency to keep this going and to move it forward a little bit, then you actually get some kind of feeling within yourself that this is possible, and secondly, the community begins to think, well, this is possible. Yeah. So I think we had a couple of first ones, but that happened again because of the people who were there and who were prepared to do the compromising, to do the hard negotiations, to do the creativity, and I think we were gifted with good people.
And Judith, how did the transition play out actually on the ground with the officers in the force? How did it? Was it a very smooth transition? Were there challenges along the way?
Like any major transformational change programme, there were real challenges, and there were things that were quick wins, as Denis said. I mean, the badge, the symbols, that was so important that was visible to the organisation, and I think cleverly wove in the symbols of the RUC crest, the harp and the crown, and the cross of St Patrick at the middle. But in terms of the change process, it was incredibly challenging, but there were things that officers and staff on the ground really welcomed. So, for example, new IT. I mean, the RUC had been underinvested in IT for years. I can remember attending conferences in England and people asking me for my email address, and I had to be kind of embarrassed and say, well, we don't have email. And they would look at us as if we were from the Jurassic era. And that wasn't necessarily the RUC's fault, because so much of the capital money had to be put into rebuilding police stations that were bombed, you know. So there were things in the Independent Commission's report, and as Denis has quite rightly said, significant funding, capital and revenue funding was put into the transformational change programme. But there were things that officers and staff on the ground really welcomed, and you know, new vehicles, new equipment, less lethal options, which hadn't been available in my time growing up through the RUC. So controversially, taser, of course, you may remember, Denis, from the policing board, the discussions around that. New batons, new firearms, CS spray, water cannon, different types of public order vehicles. Those were very visible manifestations of investment and change. New training. Sadly, the new Fit for Purpose College was never realised. But you know, seeing those things happen to police officers and staff on the ground were welcome, and people could see that the change was actually perhaps going to do them some good, as well as the new accountability structures, new oversight, independent police ombudsman. Police Federation had called for many years for an independent investigation of police complaints. So all of those things were very important with regard to public confidence, but also boosting internal confidence, seeing decision-making delegated, budgets delegated, where local police commanders could make decisions for themselves around staffing and resources, and a new culture of financial accountability, which was really new within the organisation. So, I mean, I could talk until midnight about what it felt like, but yeah, it wasn't without its challenges, and it wasn't without its critics. But by and large, you know, over the 10 years, when you look back, it was an amazing, successful transformational change programme, and internationally people are still coming to look at the change programme here that was delivered in Northern Ireland.
One of the first things that happened to me when I went on the board was I went down to the local barracks, and the biggest complaint that I got from there was that they couldn't order a new chair without going through headquarters. Mm-hmm. That everything was centralised, and that there was no delegation at all down below, and that if you could get us a bit of power down here, we could at least order our chairs, right? And that began, I think, people who were, at the sergeant level up, I suppose, were conscious of those things, and that began to happen fairly fast.
Yeah. Yes, well, you've cut in a nice story about going to the police station and the commander telling us that he'd had to go out and buy a kettle because if he'd put it through the system, it would take 3 years at least to get it. So whether that's exaggeration or not.
There were crazy things. It happens. Organisations fossil unless there's kind of renewal that's happening all the time, and unless that's been looked at. And I do think that the police had fossiled in that period. It was all about the external and the troubles that were happening out there. And I do remember some of the uniform, or some of the equipment was really, really in bad shape.
Yeah. Peter, you did a lot of work to help shape and mould the police. You went to other countries to see how things were done then. Can you tell me about that and how it was adapted here?
Well, in fairness, I have to point out that the terms of reference that we were asked to execute were absolutely excellent, and they were produced by an official in the Department of Foreign Affairs. But it was really the key to the whole thing. I mean, it would have been very difficult even if we'd been left to produce our own terms of reference. I don't think we'd have done it nearly as well as it was done and led before us. And as far as the America is concerned, I mean, obviously, at this stage, it's the United States is the country probably with the worst police public attitude in the developed world. But we went to various places. One of them was Canada, where they had developed. They have a minority problem, a number of minority problems, in the sense that they've got the original Canadian population and so on, who are very different. I beg your pardon, in terms of the customs and so on, and of course had no tradition of people being involved in policing. But they worked very hard on that and are working very hard. The other thing that they were working very hard on was dealing, with the local constable dealing with his patch and dealing with issues that arose in his patch. And it was really a very good arrangement, a good system of devolution to the individual police officer, and seemed to work very well. Now that was Canada. We then went to we actually went back to the United States. We had to fly to Los Angeles, and I remember we obviously had to go through customs again from Canada. So we arrived at Los Angeles airport, and the guy stamping the passport said to me, "What are you doing here?" And I said, "We're here to learn from Los Angeles police." And he said, "I can't believe that you're here to learn from Los Angeles police." I thought, that's pretty queer what he's talking about. But in fact, what we were doing there was we were learning about its control devices in terms of public disorder, and what they did. And I imagine this was the way that was done in America, was that you get a university to work out a scheme as to how you deal with mob violence and so on and so forth. How do you prevent it? And it turned out that in Los Angeles, they had gone to a university that had advised them to adopt a facility that was called the skunk. And the skunk was, what you did was, if you're an officer dealing with rioters and so on, you put a substance on your upper lip, right? And the people you were dealing with would all retch. This is true, retch, and would retreat. You then were given an antidote that you put before you were done for, it also meant that had one great disadvantage, and that is that people would rush back into their homes where their old granny would be sitting, and the next thing old granny had to be taken to hospital because of this substance being brought into the house. But it did. This was the problem of how you dealt with plastic baton rounds, which was really a really big problem. How do you deal with a crowd without using something like a baton round? I mean, it was the rubber bullet was the problem, of course, and there's been years of litigation about people who alleged that they were seriously injured unnecessarily by this particularly robust way of dealing with crowds. So that was another of the. We then went to New York, which was very interesting in the sense that they were very strong on policing with the public, right? And they did things like if you were, I mean, there were a number of sort of facets to this. One of them was the broken windows theory that was developed at Rutgers University, which indicated to us that if you had a neighbourhood which started to run down, the next thing the windows were all being broken in the empty houses and so on. The junkies would move in, the drug dealers and so on and so forth. How was that to be dealt with? Did you just go in, wade in and attack them? And of course that wasn't the way that you could do it, but you nevertheless had to somehow encourage these neighbourhoods to, as it were, redevelop and be re-inhabited by people who, as it were, just wanted to live there and would live there, and would then with the police would then deal with these problems. Now, how successful they've been down the years, I don't know.
One of the things I learned on a trip to New York with mediation in Northern Ireland was in relation to the community representatives and their involvement with the police. And there was a very, very interesting woman called Felice Kirby. I will never forget her. I always remember what she said. And she said, "We are sick of being described as the eyes and ears of the police. We're the muscle and brain as well." And that always struck a chord with me, that the answers to crime problems, and in particular local neighbourhood crime problems, lie with not the professional police but with the community. The answers are with them, and working in partnership with the community will have a much greater impact than just the professional police coming in and telling people how things should be done to them, not with them. So sick of being the eyes and ears, we want to be the muscle and brain too.
Okay, I was reflecting there with Denis, as I was on that same trip with Mediation NI. It was actually 2 months after September 11th. I was actually reflecting on that, on the anniversary of that occasion too. And I think, when you reflect now, it is ironic that that anyone should be going anywhere to learn from the NYPD or Boston Police. But I think Denis was exactly right. I think secretly the rationale behind the trip that Mediation NI had took us on was really to I suppose kind of learn from each other, or start that connection amongst members of the board and the strategic command. And I remember going over in the plane and sitting beside Peter Sheridan, the local police officer here. I think he might have been ACC even at that time, and him giving me a document about which was really the framework or the bones of this idea of community policing, and trying to persuade us over the course of that week, that this is the way forward. This is how we should be entering this new era of policing, and it was no surprise, I think, over a few pints and everything else, that that was the start of that process about how we review how policing is managed, and how we really start to reconnect. And I mean, I suppose where we did maybe fall down, I think, in the early days of the formation of the PSNI was, I don't think we listened enough to police officers on the ground. I remember, like Denis did as well, spending an evening out in patrol with the officers in Derry on a Saturday night, and being shocked about how horrendous it was, going through Gallia and listening to bricks pelting off the side of the van. He actually, out of badness, he took me out to where I worked that time, Tully Alley, because there was an incident out there in the local bar, and I was kind of cowering down at the back of the car in case I was recognised, because there was a community worker there, and hearing the abuse was happening, and it wasn't, it wasn't all rosy for those officers who did feel, I think, that they weren't being listened to. And I remember at the time appealing for some form of review or some form of audit or some form of consultation with officers on the ground to find out what their concerns were and what their fears were going forward, because at that time I still had many family members who were ex-RUC officers and had made that transition, had friends as well who were doing the same, and that sense, I suppose, of disillusionment and kind of, was still kind of very raw from them. So whereas we were all listening to the political fallout and political connotations of the transition, I don't think anyone was really listening that much to the officers on the ground.
Yeah, 100%. And changes, I suppose, are continuing, and I suppose the PSNI are still in this kind of transition period and still have many challenges ahead. One of them is the 50-50 recruitment that was recommended by Patten. We're at 32, I think it's 32% Catholic officers at the moment. Denis, at the beginning, when you were thinking about 50-50 policing, was that a foolish aspiration, do you think?
No, it wasn't a foolish aspiration. If you're only at 11%, then how did you get to somewhere else? But there's a misunderstanding of Patten, of course. Patten didn't recommend that we go to 50% of nationalists or Catholics. He actually recommended you go to 30%. And after that it's up to the communities then to actually take the responsibility for that. And I think that's forgotten about. I mean, this is the Hume situation here, so I need to say that I don't fully accept that, and I have never fully accepted that 50-50 should be returned and I should be reopened again. And I do that for two reasons. First of all, it's not going to happen, and I don't think politically you should go for things that are never going to happen, that you're not going to achieve. I think that's foolish. But apart from all of that, I am not totally proud, I'm not totally convinced that my community, and that's the broad nationalist Catholic community, have actually worked hard enough on this issue. I'm not of the view that we have taken enough effort and energy and that we have taken enough responsibility to actually achieve, because we're at 32%. So, I mean, we talk about these things called the Bible, someone's the Bible. If Patten is the Bible, then he said this, right? I'm following Patten. I'm closer to Patten than anybody else is in what I'm saying now, that 32% is where we need to actually now persuade people. Our fear now is that it's about to fall away because of all the circumstances that we're thinking. So I think that this is a very important time, and there needs to be very insightful conversations and decisions made around how we actually tackle this issue. And I need to challenge my community to actually say we're not doing enough. We haven't enough converts to this. I actually think that I've noticed 2 converts within the last week. One happens to be Joe Brawley, whom I welcome on board on this issue. And I think he's become a big supporter of policing. And I think that's important, that somebody of Joe Brawley's stature, because that at least brings you into the heartlands of GA and so forth, and all of that. Probably also brings you into the heartlands of the barristers and all that of Northern Ireland. A world we know nothing about, Peter, apart from yourself. The second thing is that Father Martin McGill, I think, has joined that kind of rank now. And to be very fair to the present Archbishop, I think I've seen some statements from him recently which kind of go in that direction. But I think we're still a long, long way. I mean, I keep giving this example. It's not a perfect example, but within the Derry context, I have been to a number of carol services within the Church of Ireland over the years. We're a long way from having a carol service organised and run for and by the police in any Catholic church around here. Yeah. And until we get to that stage, I think that we have to keep asking ourselves, why aren't we there? Because that's where we need to go. Because the police have to be part of whom we are. And I think that there's a lot of responsibility within Sinn Féin, whom I think were slow to come onto this issue, and certainly have understood very well, and I respect their understanding of this, of the need to hold policing to account. That I understand, that's correct. What I don't understand is that you can also be very supportive while you hold to account. There is no contradiction between being supportive and holding to account. And being supportive, as I heard a statement from a Sinn Féin, very senior Sinn Féin person saying recently, it's not up to us to tell our community to join policing or something of that nature. Well, I disagree. I think it is your responsibility to tell our community to join policing. That is our responsibility, and I think that's the responsibility of the GAA and every other, the church and every other, the schools and all that type of situation. Wonderful, by the way. There was a wonderful interview by a girl called Una Jennings, whom I don't know, from Ballymagordy on Radio 4 this morning. She said all of this, right? She said much better, much more articulately than I ever could say it. She's now Deputy Constable somewhere, Assistant Chief Constable somewhere, and I thought, dear God, I actually made an appeal to get her back. We need, women for a start, and we need people who are that articulate. But those are the understandings that we need to actually grapple with. I'm a little bit afraid, I said this to someone yesterday, that we're going out to recruit 400 new officers within the next 3 weeks. And I'm not too sure we've done the groundwork. And what I mean by doing the groundwork is I want to get into the hard areas within the nationalist community, and I also want to get into the hard areas within the loyalist community. And I want, some kind of enthusiasm built up that this is a good job, that this is a job we should be thinking about. There's good money in it, there's great pensions in it, there's good prospects in it, right? All of those things I think we need to grapple with within the next period of time. Sorry, I said enough within that.
The imbalance was the most difficult aspect of our work, in the sense that we knew that it was going to cause mayhem if we actually distorted the recruitment balance, which we had to do. And in fact, we got expert advice about how you might set about this. We also checked about its impact on the human rights legislation. That wasn't a problem at the end of the day. But obviously, to insist that one side of the community would get this tremendous advantage, admittedly in the short term, because it was only recommended on the basis that when the imbalance was sorted, then it could go, hopefully at some stage in the future. The system would be that your religion, your background was ignored, and you competed against the criteria, which would be exactly the same in both, as far as both communities are concerned. But the trouble was that the imbalance, of course, had a huge political impact at the beginning, and probably made it very difficult for Trimble, because even though Trimble is on the record of insulting me for being a Lundy, but I knew Trimble well enough to know that that it was all fake, as far as his, being rude to me and so on publicly, because he had to show that he was, a staunch loyalist to keep his first ministership. But I'm afraid it wasn't enough.
But it was certainly,
That's what I was going to ask you, Brian, actually. Did you find, working in sort of unionist, loyalist circles, did you find that 50-50 recruitment was it counterproductive? Was it an insult to some members of the community?
It didn't just have political connotations. It was probably it was the big issue locally that people found very, very difficult to swallow and deal with. And I know we're going to talk about current policing issues now, but there has been a legacy towards that, in terms of creating that disconnect between working class unionism and now. It was never something I agreed with at all. I know Denis talked about kind of the other methods of encouraging diversity in recruitment, and I hear the Chief Constable last week kind of reiterating that, that it's up to all of us, all of society, be it the community sector, be it church leaders, politicians, to encourage young people to engage and to apply. But my problem was that wasn't at the forefront of discussions back in 2001. That was never seen as an alternative, and that created a huge amount of ill feeling. I remember now, and I mentioned it this morning on Radio Foyle as well, at that time being approached by two working class young Protestants who had applied. The recruitment process itself was scandalous, because everyone went through all stages of recruitment, and then after that the appointment process went back to look at what primary school they went to, and then judged what religion they were based on their primary school education. So they were basically sifting people through based on the fact that on their religion, and we're getting letters to say, sorry, you were deemed a successful applicant, but you don't meet the quota. You know, and that's horrendous. And in any society, you know, that was happening. Young people who, you know, 19, 20 were being punished because of the sins of their forefathers or because of some system of what they were born into. And actually 2 of those young people who approached me were forced then to move to police services in England. One joined the Met and another joined a police service in the northeast of England, and both now are very, very successful police officers. You know, so it's a very hard thing to you know, for me to accept and for those young people to accept. And I think, you know, that might have created the fissure that became the chasm around ownership within the unionist community towards police. And that was, I think, the signal that said, well, actually, we don't really want you. This is not your police service anymore. We're going to be putting our kind of priority and resources into trying to win over the nationalist community. And I don't think it was any secret at the time, you know, and probably quite understandable. You know, when you look at the early years of the reform, there was a conscious decision at command level to try and win over sections of the community where policing weren't endorsed. But you remember at that time too, Sinn Féin didn't join the policing board until way after. You know, and I think that was understandable at the time. But what happened in between times was that all of a sudden this police service and security service that the unionist community felt ownership of was all of a sudden disappearing from our streets. You know, so whereas before you would have had brothers and sisters and uncles who would have lived within those communities, they weren't there anymore, nor were they visible dealing with local crime. You know, so that kind of sense of ownership very much dissipated. It didn't just impact on, I suppose, how young unionists seen policing, but also kind of other members of Protestant communities. All of a sudden, people who felt safe in their community, who felt that the security forces were protecting us and dealing with localised crime, were finding that level of service wasn't there. You know, so it started, I think, a process which we're still, even now, 20 years after, trying to pull back from.
Yeah.
But there's a complexity in that, Brian, I think, which needs at least touched upon. Patten also recommended that well, first of all, we got rid of reserve policing and part-time police officers. Was it part-time they were called? What was it called?
Police officers part-time.
Part-time. And then the reserves?
Full-time reserve.
Full-time reserves, right? So we got rid of those and we never replaced them, right? Now, most of those were coming from actually the communities that you're referring to. And we didn't, in England, they did replace them to some degree in the sense that they set up they became plastic policemen. They were called plastic policemen, but they actually
community support officers.
Community support officers, right? But the interesting thing I think about community support officers, I was a big supporter of community support officers and tried to fight hard on the board to actually get it done or get it implemented, and I think it was the politicians or some of the politicians who fought against it or certainly didn't want it implemented. I think it's a mistake from this point of view. Not that it necessarily adds a terrible lot perhaps to the efficiency of policing, but what it adds to it is the integration of policing within the community. And I think that's the important thing. And I think that the loyalist communities lost a lot of that type of stuff, and the Catholic communities never experienced it.
But it also added to the diversity of policing,
Dennis.
Yes. I mean, we talk about historical imbalances. As an applicant to the RUC in 1981 who was turned down twice because of her gender, if we want to talk about historical imbalances, I'm up for that conversation, definitely. But I also married into a family that is third generation policing. So in nationalist Republican communities, those generations of policing are very, very rare. And the definition of madness is doing the same things and expecting different results. And whatever the RUC did to attract more Catholic applicants, it never got beyond 10, 11%. Of course, when the RIC was in existence, the Catholic representation was much, much higher. But for many, many reasons, that representation fell away. So something new and different and radical had to be done. And 50-50 was deeply controversial, Brian, for all the reasons that you have said. It was unfair to the unionist community. But many critics of 50-50 said that it was about lowering standards so as other people could get in. Brian has alluded to the fact it was not about lowering standards. Everyone had to go through the same battery of tests and got into a merit pool from which student officers were drawn off, one Catholic, one non-Catholic. So everyone met the high standard that was required, and it's really important that that is said. But I know to this day there are Unionist politicians who refused to come to PSNI graduations because of 50-50, because it was so hurtful, so unfair, so discriminatory against Unionists. But a special derogation had to be sought from European equality legislation, as Peter will know better than anybody. That derogation lasted a defined period, and after that it was a political decision not to renew 50-50 after 10 years, because it had achieved, actually it had more than achieved the target, because the target was between 15 and 30%, because that was a critical mass that would start to change the dominant culture. So it was successful. It was a political decision not to withdraw, but it was deeply controversial, and many people to this day have not forgiven the organisation for that.
Yeah.
Or us.
Indeed.
I'm going to ask all of you now, if you were Simon Byrne, I'm going to ask all of you, if you were Simon Byrne at this moment in time, what would you be doing to build confidence in the PSNI as they mark their 20th year? What would you want to start, Denis?
It's a massive question. It's a massive question. First of all, I would be a little bit more upbeat than perhaps the narrative is. I mean, the police are, if you listen to the narrative of the commentary that's going on at the moment, apart from the police themselves, you would kind of think that things are in pretty much in a bad shape, a lot of disarray. And I'm quite sure the last couple of years have not been easy, and there have been mistakes made. But the infrastructure of Patten has survived, and I think that's very, very important. And the policing board, which in some ways is the kind of the crown of all of that, the head of all of that, has actually survived. And despite, you know, the bad politics of the last couple of years, and there was a few very crucial moments, the policing board has survived, and the police are getting on with their job, and that's incredibly important within the type of dynamics, political dynamics, in which we're confronted. Now, so that's actually a positive, and I think that if I was Simon Byrne, I would hold on to that, and I would say, well, that's the reality. I'm not talking about, well, he may read from that too. He has survived as well. That's fair enough. The next thing in all of that is that he actually has around him, I don't know if he realizes this, but I thought the best commentary this week came from the police themselves. I heard a number of police officers speak, and I thought they spoke with intelligence, I thought they spoke with insight, I thought that they spoke with great temperance, and I think that's important that you have such people around you. Now, there has been some criticism that the top team are perhaps not up to it and not as good as they should be and so forth. I'm quite sure most top teams within all organisations get that type of criticism. But all I'm saying is that I don't know these people anymore, but what I heard this week I thought was quite good and of a high standard. I think that's important and so forth. I do think that that there's big jobs to be done. I think that there has a lot of learning to be done. I think that the policing board has a big decision to make. Having survived all of this, it has to decide very soon whether it wants to become much more public than what it has allowed itself to become. I think it has gone too low within the public consciousness. And I don't think that's a good thing, because there's a lot of arguments, there's a lot of discussion that has to take place. And who's going to do it if the policing board doesn't do it? They may not have to do it personally, but they have to initiate it, they have to facilitate it, they have to create it. So I think that he needs to tell his board, I need your support, I need your help, not just privately, I need it publicly as well. A lot of arguments have to be made, and who's going to make the arguments unless the board initiates it? Some of the arguments are around some of the narratives that are now that are almost going in, is that the perceptions are the reality when they're not. I mean, on the loyalist community, we're getting this whole thing, or the Unionist community, this whole thing about two-tier policing, right? I would be saying to the loyalists, show me, prove to me, let me see the evidence, I want it examined. And by the way, that word two-tiered policing is, I think it was instigated by Sinn Féin rather than by the loyalists, if my memory serves me right. And I heard somebody in our community locally in Derry here recently, and the question was asked, well, why wouldn't you join the police, or what would you have against them? And there was some criticism. And then I listened to the rest of it and I thought, you haven't said anything. You haven't said anything. You haven't really said anything apart from, no, they could be doing better. Yeah, we all know that, right? So I think that there has to be some pushback. I think somebody needs to begin to push back on certain things. What I mean by push back on things, right? I mean, to a degree, the politics, and I think the police were silly on this, or could have been at least more intelligent on this. We have been through COVID, and the police decided that they were going to police COVID. They should have told this community, we can't police COVID. We of course, there are times we'll have to implement the law, but we can't police COVID. That's a public health issue, and police cannot be all things to all men. And yet, at the moment, it seems to me, within the north of Ireland, on a yearly basis, more and more and more and more is expected of policing. And it's just not doable, because our health service is in bits. A lot of all of the institutions are not in great shape. The administration of public institutions is not particularly good. If you take, for example, mental health around here at the moment, perhaps is not particularly good. And I think you tell the story of what it was like in the bad old days. I think if you were out on a Saturday night at the moment, and the police officers, you know, in a car, I think that you would find that it's not an easy job to be running to back and forth to hospitals with people who are not in good shape.
I think, Dennis, just to come back on the, the issue of two-tiered policing. I mean, I think that you're right. I think there needs to be a further examination into the reality of that, and I suppose what I'd be suggesting to the Chief Constable is that he carries out a similar piece of consultation that he has in Newry recently. But from my experience, I mean, unionism is fractured. You can argue as to whether the policing operations have added to that, or whether policing is collateral damage to it. From my personal experience in this city, I mean, there is a sense within the kind of nationalist communities here in Derry that it's almost policing by invitation, and I've seen that personally with my own eyes, because I'm a member of the Institute Football Club Board. We've been playing in the Brandywell for a couple of years, and we had to negotiate with and work with the local community in the Brandywell to allow those matches to happen, because the police would not come in to the Brandywell on a Saturday. They would stop at the end of Craigavon Bridge, and myself and others from the Brandywell community would then take over effectively the policing of that community. Whereas if you reflect on how the civic unrest was dealt with in April here, there was certainly a sense that the PSNI were much more heavy-handed in dealing with that. They would probably challenge that view. They would challenge it, but I mean, but we've dealt with that. But again, as indicated at the very start, none of this stuff is black and white. There's a lot of nuances, and and I suppose what I'd be asking the Chief Constable to try and ensure is that he and his officers look at that reconnection. How do community police officers, how do we get back to the principle of what Peter Sheridan had evolved all those years ago? Because it isn't consistent. I mean, you can go into new buildings, for example, where the local community association have a very good relationship with the community police, but you can go to other areas and there's not. So it's about making that connection. And I know we all have a responsibility for making those connections ourselves, but I think our officers need to be more proactive in making those connections, because the unionist community generally are open to that. So to me, I'd be saying, look, make that connection, because unfortunately what we're seeing in working class loyalist areas is that young generation that were born maybe less than 20 years ago are looking at policing the same way as young nationalists, maybe in the city area as well. They see it as a state forces, they see it as authority, and they don't have that sense of ownership or respect of the community. So it needs that kind of broad brush.
There's a further complication, Brian, and that is the dissonance. I mean, if you go into Craig and you go into Ballymaccorty as a police officer, you feel that you're under threat. If you go into the loyalist community, you don't feel under threat from that point of view. You may feel under threat from a riot, but you do not feel under threat that you could be shot or attacked. That's the difference, and that's something that needs to be clarified, because it's very difficult in that situation. Sometimes I think that the threat is overblown, and I don't know where it is at the moment, because I don't even know if there's been a dissident incident in 2 years in this city, and yet I think that we're possibly living as if we were 2 years ago. So I think there's a big examination of all of that. So that's a very difficult one, and I can't really comment on, because I haven't got the. But I would be looking for the intelligence on that. I would be looking for and I would also be looking for where the politics and all of that is, right? Because I think that's part of the challenge. I mean, you know, we still are under the Good Friday Agreement with the responsibility lying on two governments. And of course, one of the things that has happened in the last 2 years, in the last 3-4 years, is a big breakdown within the relationship between the British and Irish governments. And it's not just good at this moment of time. So that's not actually adding to any of the I suppose, the climate that we would hope to have within this type of situation. And that has to be managed. But one of the management things that I would be quite critical about is not just the police or not just the politics of Northern Ireland. I would be very critical of the Irish government's involvement. I do not think that they have been not involved to the degree in which they should have been involved in the actual continuation of that debate that I think has to take place within the broad nationalist community. I think that the Irish government should be going into Craigan, right, and actually talking about this issue. They should be going into, you know, that's not good enough to say it in the door, right? You need to go into Craigan, or I'm just using Craigan, Ballymagorty, South Armagh, wherever you want to do it, West Belfast. You have to get in there and talk about these issues, and that has to be the responsibility. But also they need to tell us now where the dissonants are, right? They need to tell us where the dissonants are. Is the dissonance gone away? And have they transformed themselves into a serial or whatever, all the group that they're talking about? I mean, there's a very interesting thing I think is happening tonight or tomorrow night, where a group of, I think they call themselves dissonants, I only come across this by accident, are actually having a meeting in Derry about that we should decriminalise drugs. Right? Now, this is the same group who were shooting people not all that long ago. So I don't know what's going on within that community, but I would like to know, and I think it would be very important for an actual approach to all of that type of stuff.
I think our threat level here is still severe. I suppose maybe that
well,
hasn't been investigated.
They're calling it severe, yeah. But I don't trust people who make security pronouncements about severity, because there's layers around that too, right?
I suppose, but they're trying to keep officers safe as well at the same time.
I know.
Judith, can I we're running out of time here quite quickly, but Judith, can I ask you, looking back and with the space that 20 years has given us, how do we see the contribution in this very historic week that the RUC has made to Northern Ireland, the Northern Ireland we love today? What contribution have they made?
Whenever I was serving as Deputy Chief Constable and whenever I was having a particularly bad day, my office was right beside the RUC Memorial Garden, and I would have taken myself out for 10 minutes and sat in the Memorial Garden to remind myself that, bad as things might be, they could have been an awful lot worse were it not for the service and sacrifice of RUC colleagues who paid the ultimate price. And widows, widowers, families, children, parents are left carrying that grief today. And we must never, ever forget that. And I think that sacrifice laid the foundation for the possibility of a new policing dispensation. It's still a fledgling organisation. I mean, if this was a human being, 20 years old, traditionally you got the key to the door when you're 21. But the PSNI is now an adult, and I think needs to be treated as an adult and needs to have adult conversations with adult politicians. You know, the society has not moved on the way policing has. Our children are still educated in separated schools. Public housing, to a large extent, is still separated. We haven't dealt with the legacy of the past that drags the PSNI back like an anchor every day. The progress that policing has made is phenomenal, but it's far from perfect, and the peace that we enjoy today is fragile and imperfect, but it was based on the sacrifice of the RUC, and if that hadn't happened, we wouldn't be where we are today, and we must never ever forget that. And that's why the Patten report very sensitively included the recommendation about the George Cross Foundation, about the study bursary, about keeping the name of the RUC as part of the PSNI. I don't know how you said it, Denis, but it was part of the deeds, but it was incorporated into the PSNI. It wasn't disbanded. And whilst I know that the change was very painful for many, many people, the fact that the RUC name is in perpetuity part of the PSNI is so very important.
Denis, can I just say to you the last question here? You were there at the birth of the PSNI, so to speak. What would you like the PSNI to look like in 20 years' time?
I would like to see a greater representation from all the various communities, but the communities are going to change in 20 years' time. There will be less concentration upon calling people Protestants and Catholics for a start. So the 50-50 will not be perhaps as important in that sense, because fewer people will be actually putting their identity on those identities. But the police themselves, I think there's a great opportunity, because we've been through so many bad things, and also because we have so much knowledge and experience, that actually if we could get some of the things, a number of things right, like integrating into the communities. If I could put it this way, I would love to see them the way the guards are, but with the expertise of the PSNI, right? Because, no matter what happens in the south of Ireland, the guards are really integrated within the community. And yet they let a lot of things happen that should never have happened, and they let that fossilization happen. We don't have the integration that the guards have, but we don't have the problems that the guards have. So if we could actually meet those two things and bring those two things together, and by the way, it's very interesting that a good few of our people are emigrating south and becoming head and leaderships within the guards, and not so many coming north, right? But there's an interesting dynamic going on within that, and I think that the guards are benefiting from the fact that the PSNI have been through all the things that they have been through, and the learning that has happened within that. So if I was to look into 20 years, if we could integrate those two great strengths, one is the real rootedness of a police service within its community, whereby that community, the guards, no matter, they're a little bit like Johnson, no matter what they do, they still stay up, 80% of acceptability. And if we had the efficiency that we have actually learned over the period of time and the changes that have happened, and you integrated those two things, then I think that we would be as close as you get within policing, because policing is never going to be, top of the pops.
Interestingly, Denis, we were talking about policing of COVID, and from my experience as a member of the Garda Policing Authority, the guards stepped into spaces that no other police service that I'm aware of stepped into. So delivering prescriptions, food parcels, reassuring older people in vulnerable rural communities. In terms of domestic abuse, they really upped their game and stepped in when victims couldn't reach out. They reached in and put in place a specific proactive operation. So there is a lot of learning from how they have really built on their embedding in the community. But it is important to say also that they're a much bigger organisation, and they're better resourced in terms of community police officers. And I think going back to the start of this conversation about the Independent Commission's report, 7,500 police officers, 2,500 police officers part-time in a normal policing context. Well, none of that has happened. This is not a normal policing context, and we still have a lot fewer than 7,500 police officers. Not that I would ever want Simon Byrne to be tied to a specific number of police officers, but there's definitely something about, and I'm not presuming to give Simon Byrne advice either, in case that would be interpreted that way, but there's definitely something about reinvesting in policing with the community and neighbourhood policing,
There's
and retaining good police officers
There's a
who are
fascinating article that I
consistent.
want to refer people to. It's not that I agree with everything in it, but Fintan O'Toole had a magnificent article that needs to be debated around here about visibility and about safety and about safe spaces. And it came out of the situation that on the railways in Dublin, in the south,
Yeah.
that there's been a lot of people attacked, a lot of the employees have been attacked, people are feeling unsafe. And he did this article the other day about visibility. I think that there's a lot of things to be said about visibility. That's where I would go back to, you know, the reserve police or whatever way you call them, the part-time of that situation, embedding it. We have to relook at all of that again, and I think that there's a big debate to be had on that.
Yeah. Okay, well, we've spanned 2 decades tonight, and I think we'll end on that note. Thank you very much to my panellists tonight, and for you for joining us for this discussion, very important discussion. And we'll see you next time.